Hello, my name is Peter Damgaard. I'm part of the Constructive Institute here in Aarhus in Denmark. I want to talk about a recent survey we did where we asked more than 2,000 Danes about their experiences and opinions about news in 2020 here in Denmark. So our study builds on a rich array of existing knowledge out there. So you probably know some of these reports that you've seen before from the Reuters Institute, from Ipsos Mori, and from the Edelman Trust Barometer. But what we wanted to do was we wanted to set out to have a little deeper dive into some of these topics. We not only wanted to learn more about where people click, what are their preferences, but we also wanted to learn more about their ideals for the news, their hopes for news, and how they react to the news. So in summary, how they experience news and what the effects are on their mood and their actions. So what we did was we got together with some representatives from the industry, from the media sector, from the public service media, from the private media, and we set out some guidelines on what we wanted to explore. And we hired an external consultancy company that has vast experience in the field and asked them to conduct a survey. And it's important to stress that they have been responsible for the data gathering and the data processing. We have been part of developing the concept. And of course, with us being Constructive Institute, we have a great interest in the constructive journalism elements of this survey. But it's also important to stress that we actually did not set out to interview people on their perception of constructive journalism and constructive news. But that was obviously part of the survey. But they were actually just asked to be surveyed on their opinions on news in general. And we then subtracted all of the results that play into the constructive journalism movement. So we surveyed 2,000 Danes, and this survey has been conducted only in Denmark, but our hope is that we can spread it out to other countries. I also want to mention briefly that we actually also repeated the survey after the COVID-19 pandemic hit the world to see if that had any effect on people's perception and people's experience with news, but I don't want to go too much into that, but you can read more about that in the report. It's published in the report. I also want to just send our gratitude to the Salling Foundations who made this survey possible through our Constructive News Lab. So one of the first things we wanted to look at was people's tendency for news avoidance. This is a topic that has been covered widely by other publications, most notably by the Reuters Institute for and in their digital trends that they publish annually, and that you'll hear more about from Rasmus Kleis. But what we wanted to do, we wanted to see how that links with some of the factors we are most concerned with in the constructive journalism movement. So what we find is that 16% of the Danish population say that they periodically avoid the news. And we can have a discussion about if that is a large number or a small number in an international setting and in international comparison. It's not actually not very large, but it's 16% is very consistent with the findings of the Reuters Institute. But what we're more interested in is what are some of the drivers. And what we find is that in our survey, 31% of the Danes also reply that news often puts them in a bad mood. And we see that these are some of the people that are more prone to news avoidance. The same goes for the people who think that news focuses way too much on conflict. These are also people who are more prone to news avoidance. And we also see a correlation with low trust in news. If you feel that news and journalists and media are less credible, that will also help drive news avoidance. And last, in terms of the media usage, we find that people who use social media and streaming are more prone to news avoidance. And if we look at the demographics, somewhat to our surprise, we find that this is primarily, this is significantly stronger with the young people, with the younger generations. And not to our surprise, we see that women are a little more prone to news avoidance. So this is actually fairly consistent with the results we find everywhere, and something that I think we need to take very seriously, especially when we compare it to international results, where we see that the global trends are even more alarming than what we see here in Denmark. So in terms of the constructive journalism movement, something we talk a lot about is this perception of a negativity bias. And we wanted to set out to see if this is also something that we experience when we ask the news consumers. And it's important to say that when we look at this data chart, this is from our publication. We don't measure if there is actually a huge negativity or conflict bias in the media, but we measure people's perception of such a bias. And the results are pretty astounding. So as you see from the table below, or in the slide, you will find that 58% agree that too much news focuses on conflict. And if you look at the other end of the spectrum, only 10% actually disagree. Again, this is not to say that we shouldn't publish news that focuses on conflict. Obviously, with the COVID pandemic being very present right now, and we've seen terror attacks, conflict is a natural part of the news as it is being portrayed today. But this is certainly an indication that people think that that the balance has tipped. So we also wanted to know how that reflects in if we look at the other side of the scale. So we asked people if you think that news focuses as much on the negative as the positive. And we find that more than half of the Danish population disagree with that statement, and only 50% concurs, which again is an indication that there's a great emphasis on negativity. Again, this is not to say that the media should focus on positive sides only, to the contrary, but we need to have a balance, and we feel that a table like this is a good opportunity to have that discussion. We also wanted to dive a little more into these issues of trust. There is a tendency to say that trust is in great decline, which is also the case in a lot of countries. It's actually not that bad if you look at Denmark, where we see that trust, although at some would say too low a base level, it's actually not been declining substantially through the years. Actually, it's been pretty steady over the years. But if we look at some of the metrics that lie behind the credibility of the profession of media and journalists, we try to survey people on their perception. So we ask people, is it your impression that news is often published before it's been thoroughly researched? We ask if they feel that journalists are influenced by their own agenda. We ask if media exaggerates news. And last but not least, we wanted to know if they feel that news paints a fair and accurate image of the world. And again, we were quite surprised to see that a substantial proportion of the Danish people are actually fairly critical when it comes to credibility. So when 46% of the people say that they feel that news is being published before it's been thoroughly researched, I think that is definitely something you have to take seriously. So again, we did not measure if it's actually the case that people, that news media do publish stories that are not researched extensively, but people are left with that perception, and that is obviously something we have to discuss. So what we see is that people who have a greater sense of fairness, if you look at some of these parameters, they're actually less likely to be prone to news avoidance. So again, this sort of links to this thing we keep talking about, like how can we keep people engaged in news, and on the other side, avoid them shutting off the news. At the same time, we see that men and the older generation have less faith in the credibility of media and journalists. And that is also actually not very surprising, but again, the bigger question here is that it can be a driver of news avoidance, which obviously we want to avoid. Furthermore, we wanted to survey people on their wishes and their desires for journalism. So we asked about some of the news ideals. So we presented the respondents we surveyed with a number of actions that media can take. So for example, media can choose to be more thorough in illuminating a case from several sides. As you see right in the bar chart, it's actually the top priority for people. And what we find is that actually 3 of the 4 top priorities are news ideals that we try to promote in the constructive journalism. So when we say that we need more nuance and more context to our news, that actually corresponds very well with people demanding that a case is illuminated from more sides, and we see that it's actually 68%. The same goes for people who are demanding more focus on possible solutions to societal problems, which is, you know, an obvious reference, can be an obvious reference to solutions journalism. And lastly, what I want to highlight is that more than 50% say that they want more journalism to inspire action. So we feel very confident that at least when you ask people about their ideals, they would like the media to give more priority to some of the actions that we also feel are important elements of the constructive journalism. We also wanted to include some experiments to see what are the actual effects of constructive journalism. So the first experiment we conducted was an experiment where we wanted to see the effect of different headlines. So we selected 10 various topics ranging from alcohol consumption among the youth, polio, robbery, child mortality, etc. And we gave people 2 options or several options and asked them what story they preferred to read. So on the right side of the slide, you can see 2 examples. One example where we have 2 headlines. Danish scientists have found the first vaccine against tuberculosis in 100 years. So headlines that offers hope and looks into the future. Or an alternative, more conventional headline which says tuberculosis kills 1.6 million people globally each year. So both headlines are correct, and both headlines have been taken from real life media pieces or publications. And what we did in the survey is we presented people with a randomized selection of 20 headlines. So they weren't presented with the option either choose the negative or the conventional or the constructive headline. They were just asked to choose the story they would prefer to read. And what we find is that when we do that experiment over and over again with the respondents, in 50% of the cases, people will choose a constructive news headline. And the results, for example, with the tuberculosis example, is that when you actually try to put them across from each other, people are twice as likely to say that they would give priority to a story with a constructive story when given the choice. So for us, again, this is a very good example that we have a conventional wisdom. You know, there's a saying that if it bleeds, it leads. So there would be a natural expectation that the headlines that would catch more eyes and catch the attention of the readers would be the conventional, maybe more sensational headlines. But in our experiments, when we ask people about what their priorities would be, we actually see a majority choosing the constructive headlines. We also wanted to do an experiment to see the effects on how we angle the news. So we chose to produce 6 news articles in 3 categories. And as you see on the slide on the left, we didn't choose any happy, fluffy topics. It's actually very serious topics. And what we did is we wrote 2 versions of news stories. And these are news stories based on real life facts and news stories that we have seen in different versions in real life media. So on the left side, underneath the 3 categories, you see a 2018 press release from the UN. And that pretty much word to word corresponds to the headline we used in our experiments: a child under 15 dies every 5 seconds around the world. We then also did a version where we said more children in the world survive than ever before in history. And in the stories, we tried to include the exact same information, so people would get the same facts, but we wrote them with an angle, with a constructive angle and a more classical conventional angle. And what we find is that when people read the constructive news stories, 39% agree that the world needs more of those kinds of stories, which for us is an indication that they want to read more of this kind of news. Compared to only 28% when presented with a conventional story. We also find a significant result when we look at what the stories do in terms of making people uncomfortable. So we see that 45% who read the conventional story about rape, they report that they feel uncomfortable, which is not surprising when you talk about stories about rape, or which are obviously always to some extent uncomfortable. But we see a significant effect that when we write a constructive angle to the same story, that number drops to 20%. So again, this is not to say that one angle is always the correct angle, but it does give some pause to think about the effects that the angles have on the readers. And it's certainly worth a journalistic consideration to know that that some of the angles can make people feel very uncomfortable. That's not to say that you shouldn't write a story that makes people uncomfortable, but you have to be aware that that can also be a driver for news avoidance. So what are some of our key takeaways? Well, first, we were actually quite surprised that the numbers were so clear. There's definitely a perceived negativity bias out there. And even though we know that a lot of media are doing a great job in trying to combat this bias, and even though it may not be as grave as people perceive it, there is still a wide-held perception that news focuses too much on conflict and on the negative. We also see that even though in Denmark we actually have fairly high levels of trust in media and in journalists, there are great challenges to the credibility of the same group. And of course, we have to be aware of that because, again, that can drive news avoidance. And also, we feel that we represent a business that has to be credible because we filter information for the rest of the world and for people to make informed decisions. And obviously, that requires a lot of trust. What we also take away from this survey is that there is actually a demand for constructive news. We see that people demand actions that correspond with some of the approaches to journalism that we're trying to promote through the Constructive Institute and through the constructive journalism movement. And we also actually see when we do some experiments that people tend to prefer constructive journalism, constructive news headlines. And we see that there are substantial effects and significant effects on the reader when presented with constructive stories compared to conventional stories. So I invite you all to go and read the full report on our website and write to us with any comments or questions you might have, or any ideas on how we can explore this topic further. Thank you so much for your interest and your attention.